Blood dripped from the wooden post, forming dark pools in the Mississippi earth. 10-year-old twins, Dio and Aisha, lay frozen, their father's lifeless body hanging from the ropes that had ripped his flesh to ribbons. Colonel Hartwell wiped his hands on a cloth, smiling as he walked past them toward his large house. That smile would be the last thing he would ever wear comfortably, because in that moment, watching their father's last breath leave his shattered body, the twins made a silent pact that would transform them from children into something far more dangerous. What followed wasn't just revenge, it was a slow, calculated descent into madness that would leave the colonel begging for the mercy he never showed. This isn't entertainment, it's memory. So sign up now and join the resistance. The August heat pressed down on Hartwell Plantation like a suffocating blanket. Dio felt sweat mixing with tears on his face, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away from his father's body swaying slightly in the breeze that offered no relief from the oppressive Georgia sun. Beside him, his twin sister Aisha's hand found his. Her grip was so tight it hurt, but the pain was nothing compared to what burned inside his chest. Their father, Samuel, had been the strongest man they knew. He taught them to read in secret, using charcoal on flat stones behind the quarters. He'd shown them which plants could heal and which could harm. He'd told them stories of their grandmother's homeland across the ocean, painting pictures with words of a place where they would have been free. Now, he was gone. 39 lashes for the crime of looking Colonel Hartwell in the eye when spoken to. Before we continue, I need you to understand something. Stories like this one aren't just history, they're truths that need to be heard. If you want to see how far Dio and Aisha took their vengeance, hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next will show you a side of resistance they never taught in school. The other enslaved people from Hartwell Plantation stood in a semicircle, forced to witness what happened when anyone forgot their place. Mama Ruth, the oldest woman on the plantation, was quietly sobbing. Big Thomas, who'd worked alongside Samuel in the fields, had his jaw clenched so tight Dio could see the muscles jumping. The colonel's overseer, a cruel man named Pike, with a scarred face and dead eyes, began cutting down Samuel's body. "Get back to work," Colonel Hartwell announced, his voice carrying across the yard. He was a tall man, with graying hair and the kind of face that looked pleasant until you saw the coldness in his pale blue eyes. "We've wasted enough daylight on this lesson." Dio felt Aisha's hand tighten even more. He glanced at her and saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. Her eyes, usually warm and full of life, had gone flat, empty, like all the light had been sucked out of them. "We can't," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "We can't just let this be nothing." Their mother, Grace, approached them slowly. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she'd always seemed larger because of her spirit. Now she looked shrunken, aged 20 years in 20 minutes. She reached for them, pulling them both into an embrace that smelled of lye, soap, and desperation. "Don't do nothing foolish," she breathed into their hair. "Please, babies, I can't lose you too." But Dio already knew it was too late for that. He could feel it in the way Aisha's body had gone rigid, in the way his own hands had curled into fists that wouldn't relax. Something had broken in both of them when that whip had fallen for the 39th time, when their father's screams had finally gone silent. That night, the quarters were quiet except for their mother's muffled weeping. Dio and Aisha lay on their thin mattress, staring at the ceiling while moonlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. They'd been born minutes apart, and their mother always said they shared one soul between two bodies. Right now, Dio knew exactly what his sister was thinking because he was thinking it too. "The medicine lessons," Aisha whispered. "Papa taught us about the plants, the safe ones and the dangerous ones." Dio rolled onto his side to face her. In the darkness, her eyes reflected the moonlight, making them look almost silver. "Glass," he said. "I was thinking about glass." She nodded, slowly. "Ground fine enough it looks like sugar, tastes like nothing, cuts from the inside." Slowly, They lay there in silence for a long moment, letting the terrible weight of what they were planning settle over them. They were 10 years old. They should have been thinking about games and stories, about the rare moments of joy that could be found even in bondage. Instead, they were plotting murder. "He'll suffer," Aisha said, and it wasn't a question. "Like Papa suffered," Dio confirmed. Their mother stirred in her sleep and they went quiet, but the pact had been made. Tomorrow they would begin gathering what they needed: broken bottles from behind the big house, a smooth stone to grind them into powder, a hiding place where no one would think to look. They would be patient. They would be careful. They would be exactly what the Colonel had made them. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a dog howled at the moon. The sound was mournful, like the whole world was mourning Samuel's death. But Dio and Aisha weren't mourning anymore. They were planning. And Colonel Hartwell, sleeping soundly in his grand house with his full belly and clean conscience, had no idea that his death had already begun. If that part gave you goosebumps, right, lives are not property. 3 days after they buried their father in the small plot behind the quarters, Dio made his first collection. He'd been assigned to work in the Colonel's garden, a task usually reserved for older slaves. But the plantation was short-handed after selling off 2 field workers the previous month. The garden was where the Colonel's wife, Mrs. Elizabeth, liked to take her afternoon tea, sitting in the shade while complaining about the heat to her visiting friends from neighboring plantations. Dio kept his head down, pulling weeds from between the rose bushes, but his eyes were always searching. When the white women finally went inside, he found what he'd been looking for: a broken crystal glass, half buried in the flower bed, probably tossed there by a careless servant. He wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into his pants, the sharp edges pressing against his thigh as he worked. That evening, Aisha found her own treasure. She'd been sent to the main house to help with the dinner service, her small hands perfect for the delicate work of folding napkins and arranging flowers on the long mahogany table where the Hartwells entertained their guests. While carrying dishes to the kitchen, she'd spotted it: a wine bottle that had rolled under the sideboard, forgotten and covered in dust. The kitchen staff was too busy to notice when she slipped it under her apron. They met behind the old tobacco barn after full dark, when everyone else was too exhausted from the day's labor to notice 2 children creeping through the shadows. The moon was barely a sliver, which was perfect. Less light meant less chance of being seen. "Did anyone notice?" Dio asked, his voice low. Aisha shook her head. "Cook was too busy yelling at Mary about the burnt biscuits. You?" "Clear." They'd chosen their hiding spot carefully, a hollowed section in the barn's foundation where the wood had rotted away, creating a small cavity barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, they'd already hidden a smooth river stone they'd taken from the creek, heavy and flat, perfect for grinding. The work was harder than Dio had expected. The crystal glass was thick, designed to survive the Colonel's heavy-handed toasts and table-pounding laughter. They took turns, one grinding while the other kept watch, switching every few minutes to give their aching arms rest. The sound of stone on glass was soft but distinct, a quiet scraping that made Dio's teeth ache. "We need to be quieter," Aisha whispered, glancing nervously toward the quarters. "If Mama hears—" "She won't," Dio said. But he pressed lighter, finding a rhythm that made less noise. Scrape and turn, scrape and turn. The glass slowly surrendered to their persistence, becoming powder that glittered in the thin moonlight like deadly snow. An hour passed. Then 2. Dio's arms burned and his hands were cramping, but he didn't stop. Every scrape of the stone was for his father. Every grain of glass powder was justice being ground into existence by hands too small to have to carry such weight. "How much do we need?" Aisha asked, staring at the small pile they'd accumulated. It was maybe a tablespoon, probably less. Dio thought about the lessons their father had given them, the quiet conversations about plants and poisons that now seemed like preparation for exactly this moment. "Enough to hurt him," he said, "but not enough to kill him right away. It has to be slow. He has to suffer." Aisha nodded, her face hard in the darkness. She looked so much older than 10 now, like the past 3 days had aged her years. We'll need weeks' worth, maybe more. Then we grind for weeks. They worked until their hands bled, until the moon had traveled halfway across the sky, and the first rooster's crow warned them that dawn wasn't far off. They carefully wrapped their deadly powder in a piece of oiled cloth taken from the tool shed and hid it deep in their cavity, covering the opening with loose stones that looked untouched. Walking back to the quarters, Dio felt something shift inside him. They'd crossed a line tonight. There was no going back. The thought should have frightened him, but instead he felt a strange calm, like he'd finally found a purpose in a life that had always been defined by other people's cruelty. Their mother was still sleeping when they slipped back inside, her breathing deep and steady. They lay down on their mattress, but Dio couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, planning. They needed access to the colonel's food, which meant one of them had to get assigned to kitchen duty or table service. Aisha was already helping with dinners sometimes, but they needed something more consistent, more reliable. "We should volunteer for breakfast service," Aisha whispered, proving once again that she could read his thoughts. "Mrs. Elizabeth is always complaining that the morning girl moves too slow. They'll wonder why we're being helpful. Then we'll be good. Perfect. The kind of slaves they think they've beaten into submission." Dio felt bile rise in his throat at the word perfect. The idea of smiling at Colonel Hartwell, of saying "yes, sir," and "right away, sir," while planning his murder, it felt like betraying his father. But then he remembered Samuel's body hanging from that post, remembered the sound of the whip cutting through flesh, remembered the colonel's smile. "Perfect," he agreed. "We'll be perfect little slaves." The next morning, Dio's hands shook as he carried water from the well, not from fear, but from exhaustion. His arms still ached from the grinding, and there were small cuts on his palms from where the glass had bitten him. But when the overseer Pike walked past, Dio was quick to duck his head, to move faster, to show the perfect combination of industry and submission that kept white folks from looking too close. Across the yard, he saw Aisha carrying laundry to the big house, her movements quick and efficient. To anyone watching, she was just another slave child doing her work. But Dio knew better. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held her head. She was a soldier now, deep in enemy territory, preparing for a war that only the two of them knew was coming. That night, they ground more glass, and the night after that, and the night after that. Each session left them exhausted and bleeding, but their pile grew. A tablespoon became 2, 2 became 4. They added the wine bottle glass to the crystal, mixing them together until they had a powder so fine it could pass for sugar or salt in dim light. Soon, Aisha whispered one night, holding up the oiled cloth packet that now held nearly half a cup of their deadly creation. "We're almost ready." Dio nodded, feeling his father's presence like a weight on his shoulders. "He's going to pay for what he did, Papa," he whispered into the darkness. "I promise." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and for just a moment, Dio could almost hear his father's voice on the breeze. Not approving, not condemning, just there, a ghost watching his children become something he'd never wanted them to be, killers, but also, in their own way, free. If you believe the truth needs to be told, click like so that the black scream does not die. The opportunity came on a hot September morning, 3 weeks after they'd started grinding glass. Mrs. Elizabeth was hosting a breakfast gathering for the plantation owners' wives, a monthly tradition where the ladies would gather to gossip, compare their servants' inadequacies, and complain about the price of imported fabric while enslaved children served them food, prepared by enslaved hands. Aisha had been assigned to the breakfast service, along with 2 older girls named Penny and Sarah. Dio watched from the garden window as his sister moved through the big house's dining room with a pitcher of cream, her face a perfect mask of servility. His heart pounded so hard he thought everyone could hear it, but he kept pulling weeds, kept his head down, kept playing his role. The packet of ground glass was hidden. in Aisha's apron pocket. They'd talked through the plan 100 times, lying awake in the darkness while their mother slept. It had to be subtle. It had to be untraceable. One attempt was all they'd get. Inside the dining room, Colonel Hartwell sat at the head of the table, his belly straining against his vest as he laughed at some joke one of the visiting ladies had made. He drank his morning coffee with cream and 3 spoons of sugar, a habit Aisha had observed during her previous service. Assignments. The sugar bowl sat on a side table, refilled each morning by the kitchen staff. Aisha's hands didn't shake as she set down the cream pitcher. Years of forced obedience had taught her how to move through white spaces like a ghost, present but unnoticed. She was just another piece of furniture to these people, as unremarkable as the chairs they sat on or the plates they ate from. "More coffee, Colonel?" she asked, her voice soft and deferential. "Yes, girl," he replied without looking at her, too engaged in his conversation about cotton prices to spare her a glance. She moved to the side table where the coffee service waited. The sugar bowl sat beside the cream, its silver lid reflecting the morning sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. Behind her, the white women were discussing a scandal involving a neighbor's daughter. Penny was refilling water glasses. Sarah was clearing empty plates. No one was watching a 10-year-old slave child reach for the sugar bowl. Aisha's hand slipped into her apron pocket. The packet of glass powder sat there, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to keep it dry. Her father's face flashed in her mind, not as he'd looked hanging from the whipping post, but as he'd been before, smiling as he taught her to read, his voice low and warm as he told her stories of ancestors who'd been warriors. She unwrapped the packet with one hand, while using the other to lift the sugar bowl's lid. The motion was practiced, smooth. They'd rehearsed it dozens of times with an empty cloth and a wooden bowl, timing themselves until the movement became muscle memory. 3 seconds to open, 2 seconds to pour, 1 second to close and return the packet to her pocket. The ground glass whispered into the sugar bowl, mixing with the white crystals like it belonged there. Aisha used the serving spoon to stir it gently, watching the deadly powder disappear completely into the innocent sweetness. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady. Steady like her father's hands had been when he'd shown her how to gather herbs, when he'd taught her which plants could heal and which could kill. "Girl, the coffee's getting cold," Mrs. Elizabeth snapped, pulling Aisha from her thoughts. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." Aisha carried the coffee pot to Colonel Hartwell's seat, filling his cup with the dark liquid. He didn't thank her, didn't even acknowledge her presence, just reached for the sugar bowl the moment she set down the pot, spooning 3 heaping measures into his coffee and stirring it with the silver spoon that probably cost more than her mother's life was worth. Aisha backed away, returning to her place by the side table. She watched as he lifted the cup to his lips, watched as he took a long drink, watched as he set it down and reached for a biscuit, laughing at something about crop rotations and railroad investments. Nothing happened. He didn't clutch his throat, didn't cry out in pain, didn't even cough. He just kept eating and drinking and laughing while Aisha's world narrowed to that single point. The cup in his hand, the poison in his belly, the beginning of the end she and Dio had been grinding into existence night after night. From the garden, Dio saw his sister's face and knew it was done. The first dose had been delivered. Now came the hardest part, waiting. That night, they met behind the tobacco barn again, but this time they weren't grinding glass. They were just sitting in the darkness, holding hands like they used to when they were younger, and the world seemed less cruel. "He didn't even taste it," Aisha whispered. "The glass just disappeared into the sugar like it was meant to be there." How much did he use? 3 spoons. In his coffee, and he sweetened his grits too. Dio did the calculation in his head. They'd put approximately a 1/4 cup of ground glass into the sugar bowl, which had been about 3/4 full. If the colonel used 3 spoons and each spoon was roughly a tablespoon, he'd consumed maybe a teaspoon of glass, maybe less. Not enough to kill him quickly, but enough to start the damage. "It'll take time," Dio said, repeating the words they'd told each other countless times during their planning. The glass cut slowly, from the inside. How long? I don't know. Weeks, maybe. Depends on how much he eats. They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the plantation. Crickets chirping, an owl hunting. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing a low, mournful song that carried across the fields. It was a sound Dio had heard all his life, the sound of their people finding small moments of beauty in a world designed to crush them. Papa would be ashamed of us, Aisha said suddenly, her voice breaking. Dio squeezed her hand. Papa would be dead no matter what we did. At least this way, his death meant something. Does it though? Will killing the colonel bring him back? Will it make anything better? No, Dio admitted, but it'll make it fair. The colonel took our father from us. We're taking his life from him. That's justice. That's revenge. Same thing. Aisha pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around her knees. What happens after? After he dies? They'll investigate. They'll ask questions. What if they figure out it was us? Dio had thought about this too during the long hours of grinding glass and longer hours of lying awake while his mother slept. They won't. White folks don't think. We're smart enough to do something like this. They'll think he got sick, old age, bad food, act of God, anything but the truth. And if they don't, if they do figure it out, then we die, Dio said simply. But we die knowing we fought back, that we didn't just let them break us. They sat in the darkness until the moon was high overhead, until their mother's worried voice called them back to the quarters. As they walked through the shadows, Dio felt the weight of what they'd done settling onto his shoulders like a physical thing. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd become exactly what the colonel and his kind had always feared, slaves who refused to stay in their place. Inside the quarters, their mother was waiting, her face tight with worry. "Where have you two been?" "Just walking, Mama," Aisha said, her voice calm despite the tears on her cheeks. "Couldn't sleep." Grace looked between them, and Dio saw the knowledge in her eyes. She knew they were lying. She knew they were hiding something, but she also knew better than to push, because some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, even in the privacy of the quarters where they were supposed to be safe. "Get some rest," she said finally, her voice heavy. "Tomorrow's another day." But as Dio lay on the thin mattress beside his sister, he knew that tomorrow wouldn't be just another day. Tomorrow Colonel Hartwell would wake up and add more sugar to his coffee. And the day after that, and the day after that, each spoonful cutting him from the inside, slowly destroying the body that had destroyed their father. It wasn't justice. It wasn't mercy. It was simply what had to be done in a world where there were no good choices, only different kinds of survival. If you saw the fine line between justice and revenge, comment, ground glass. 2 weeks after Aisha poisoned the sugar bowl, Colonel Hartwell complained about stomach pains during breakfast. Dio was working in the garden again, close, enough to the dining room window to hear Mrs. Elizabeth's concerned voice asking if he'd like her to send for the doctor. The colonel had waved her off, blaming the discomfort on bad oysters from the dinner party 3 nights prior. But the pains didn't stop. They got worse. By the 3rd week, the colonel's appetite had diminished noticeably. He pushed away plates half-eaten, his face grey and drawn. The household staff whispered about it when they thought no one important was listening. The Shidir. "Master was ill," they said. The master was declining. The master had lost weight so quickly his clothes hung loose on his frame. Dio and Aisha watched it all from the periphery, 2 children moving through the big house and gardens like ghosts, invisible and everywhere at once. They saw the colonel's hands shake when he reached for his coffee. They saw him wince when he thought no one was looking. They saw blood on the handkerchief he used to wipe his mouth, hidden quickly, but not quickly. Enough. The glass was doing its work. "We should stop," Aisha whispered one night, her voice trembling. "We should throw out the sugar bowl. Tell someone to replace it." Dio looked at his sister in the moonlight filtering through the cracks in their cabin wall. "Why?" "Because he's dying, Dio. Really dying. You can see it." "Good," Dio said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That was the point. Was it? Aisha's eyes were wet with tears. Or did we just want him to hurt a little? To understand what he did to Papa? When does it stop being justice and start being something else? Dio didn't have an answer. He'd thought he would feel triumph when the colonel started to decline. Thought he'd feel satisfied watching the man who'd killed their father waste away. But instead, he felt hollow, empty. Like the revenge he'd been grinding into powder night after night had somehow ground away parts of himself too. The doctor came the next day, a thin man with spectacles and a black bag, full of useless remedies. Dio was pruning roses outside the colonel's bedroom window when he heard the examination taking place. The doctor's voice was concerned, professional, baffled. Your digestive system appears to be severely compromised, Colonel. The bleeding suggests ulceration of the stomach and intestines. Have you consumed anything unusual? Any new foods or medicines? Nothing, the colonel rasped, his voice weaker than Dio had ever heard it. Same meals I've always had. Perhaps a contaminated water source? Spoiled meat? Everything's been fine. The slaves eat the same food we do, just the scraps. If it was contamination, they'd be sick too. Dio's hands stilled on the rose bush. The doctor was getting too close to the truth. If he started testing the food, examining the kitchen supplies, but the doctor moved in a different direction. Given your symptoms and the progression of the illness, I believe you may be suffering from stomach cancer. I've seen similar cases. In men of your age, the bleeding, the pain, the weight loss, it all fits. Stomach cancer. The words drifted through the open window like a gift, a perfect explanation that had nothing to do with poisoning, nothing to do with 2 children and ground glass, just bad luck and bad health, and the inevitable decay that came to all men eventually. That night, Aisha made her decision. She snuck into the big house during the dinner service when everyone was distracted by the meal. The sugar bowl sat on the side table, same as always. She dumped its contents into her apron, replacing it with clean sugar from the kitchen stores. Then she took the poisoned sugar outside and scattered it in the garden, grinding it into the soil with her foot until no trace remained. What did you do? Dio demanded when she told him later. I stopped it, Aisha said, her voice firm despite the tears on her cheeks. He's dying anyway. The glass already did enough damage. We don't need to keep hurting him. He deserves worse than this, Dio said, but even as he said it, he knew his sister was right. The colonel was withering away, his body betraying him cell by cell. Adding more glass now would just speed the inevitable. And maybe, just maybe, stopping before the final blow was the only way to keep from becoming as monstrous as the man they were killing. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of torture. The colonel's decline continued, but more slowly now that he wasn't consuming fresh glass. Daily, he could barely eat, barely walk. His skin took on a grayish cast, and his eyes, those cold blue eyes that had watched their father die without a flicker of remorse, became sunken and hollow. Mrs. Elizabeth stopped hosting gatherings. The plantation's operations fell increasingly to the overseer Pike, who was, if anything, crueler than the colonel had ever been. The slaves worked harder under his watch, the whip falling more frequently. Dio sometimes wondered if their revenge had made things worse instead of better. One October evening, nearly 6 weeks after Aisha had first poisoned the sugar bowl, the colonel asked to speak with the household staff. They gathered in the dining room, the cook, the house servants, even the children who sometimes helped with service. Dio and Aisha stood at the back, trying to be invisible. The colonel sat in his chair at the head of the table, a shadow of the man who'd laughed over breakfast while planning their father's punishment. His face was skeletal, his hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I know I'm dying, he said, and several of the house servants gasped, though everyone had known the truth for weeks. The doctor says I have perhaps a month, maybe less. He paused, coughing into a handkerchief that came away spotted with blood. I've been thinking about my legacy, about what I'll leave behind, and I've decided to make some changes. Dio felt Aisha tense beside him, They talked about this possibility, that the colonel might use his final days to be vengeful, to punish them all for his suffering, even if he didn't know its true source. "I'm freeing 3 of you," the colonel said, and the room went absolutely still. "Grace and her children, the woman and her twins. I'm signing the papers tomorrow." The world tilted. Dio couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he'd just heard. "Samuel was a good worker," the colonel continued, his voice rasping. "I was too harsh. The punishment didn't fit the crime. It's been weighing on me, knowing I took a father from his children over something so small. This is my way of making amends." Amends. The word echoed in Dio's head like a cruel joke, as if freeing them could somehow undo the whip marks on their father's body, as if signing papers could resurrect the dead, as if guilt-driven mercy in the final month of life could balance the scales of 39 lashes. Their mother was crying, thanking the colonel through her sobs. The other servants were murmuring in amazement. Freedom, the word they'd all dreamed of but never expected to hear. 3 people out of 47 enslaved souls on Hartwell Plantation would walk free, because Dio and Aisha had murdered their master. That night, behind the tobacco barn, Aisha broke down completely. "What have we done?" she sobbed into Dio's shoulder. "He was going to free us anyway. He felt guilty. He was trying to make it right." "No," Dio said firmly, though his own heart was heavy with doubt. He felt guilty because he was dying, because he was afraid of meeting God with our father's blood on his hands. That's not the same as actually being sorry. "How do you know?" "Because if he was really sorry, he would have freed Papa too. He would have stopped the whipping after the first lash. He would have treated us like people all along." Dio pulled back to look at his sister's face. "He's only doing this now because he's scared of what comes after. That's not redemption. That's just another kind of selfishness." Aisha wiped her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" Dio thought about his father's body hanging from the post, thought about the colonel's smile as he'd walked away, thought about all the days and months and years before that moment, all the small cruelties and large ones, all the ways they'd been treated as property instead of people. "Yes," he said, "I believe that." But late that night, lying on his mattress with his sister sleeping fitfully beside him and his mother already planning their new life as free people, Dio allowed himself to wonder. What if they'd waited? What if they'd given the colonel time to feel his guilt without the pressure of impending death? Would he still have freed them? Or would the moment have passed, the guilt faded, the convenience of ownership won out over the inconvenience of conscience? There was no way to know. The choice had been made. The glass had been ground. The poison had been delivered, and now they would live with the consequences, both the freedom they'd gained and the price they'd paid for it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and whistling through the cracks. Somewhere in that wind, Dio thought he could hear his father's voice, but he couldn't tell if it was blessing them or cursing them. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was the nature of revenge, that it always gave you what you wanted while taking away something you didn't know you needed. If you saw the fine line between justice and revenge, comment, ground glass. Colonel William Hartwell died on November 3rd, 1850 in his bed, with his wife holding his hand and the doctor shaking his head over the mysteries of stomach cancer. The funeral was a grand affair, with neighboring plantation owners coming to pay respects, their faces solemn as they spoke about what a fine man he'd been, how generous, how forward-thinking to free slaves in his will. Dio and Aisha stood at the back of the funeral crowd with their mother, wearing the simple dark clothes that Grace had stitched together from old fabric. They were free now. The papers had been signed 3 days before the colonel's death, witnessed and legally binding. In a week, they would leave Hartwell Plantation forever, heading north to a life none of them could quite imagine. But first, they had to watch the man they'd killed get buried with honors. The preacher spoke about mercy and redemption, about how Colonel Hartwell had seen the error of his ways in his final days and sought to make amends. The white mourners nodded along, dabbing at their eyes with expensive handkerchiefs. Several mentioned what a Christian thing it was, freeing those slaves. What a testament to his character. Dio wanted to scream, wanted to stand up and tell them all the truth, that their precious colonel had only freed them because he was dying, because his guilty conscience couldn't bear the weight of their father's murder, that he'd only felt remorse when facing his own mortality, never in all the years before when he'd had the power to change things but chose not to. But he stayed silent, because that's what survivors did. They swallowed their truth and wore their masks and waited for the moment when they could finally breathe free air. After the funeral, there was a reception at the big house. The enslaved staff served food and drink to the mourners, moving through the rooms like shadows, while white voices discussed cotton prices and slave markets and whether Mrs. Elizabeth would keep the plantation or sell it. No one seemed to notice the irony of discussing slave auctions at a funeral for a man being praised for his abolitionist leanings. Pike, the overseer, stood in the corner drinking whiskey and glaring at everyone. He'd lost his best friend and his easiest employer. The new owner, whoever that turned out to be, might not appreciate his particular management style. His eyes tracked Dio and Aisha wherever they went, like he knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't put his finger on what. "You three," he said when he cornered them in the hallway, "think you're special now, don't you? Think being freed makes you better than the rest?" "No, sir," Grace said quickly, pulling her children behind her. "We're just grateful for the Colonel's tentar novamente es continuar mercy." "Mercy," Pike spat the word like it tasted bad. "You ask me. He went soft in the head at the... and probably the sickness. Freeing slaves sets a bad example, makes the others get ideas." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "You know what I think? I think something happened to the Colonel, something that wasn't natural. And I think if I looked hard enough, I might find out what." Dio felt his heart stop, but Aisha's hand found his and squeezed. "Stay calm. Don't react. Don't give him anything to work with." "The doctor said it was stomach cancer, sir," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "A terrible disease, but natural causes." Pike stared at them for a long moment, his eyes narrow and calculating. Then he straightened up, taking another pull from his whiskey flask. "Maybe, maybe not. But you three better hope I never find out different, because free papers don't mean much if someone accuses you of murder. They'd hang you all, children or not." He walked away, leaving them trembling in the hallway. Grace pulled them into an empty room, her face pale. "What did you do?" she whispered. "Tell me the truth. What did you children do?" Aisha opened her mouth, but Dio spoke first. "Nothing, Mama.